I wanted to do a video today in response to Walt and Spike 60's video. Walt, or a Fleet Command, and I'll put a link in the description, did a really good video on how do you know when you buy a Husqvarna that you're really buying a Husqvarna. And the same, of course, goes for steel as well. There's a lot of knockoff parts on the market, and how do you tell? To most people that I know, to most tree guys that I've met, they don't care. As long as a saw runs and you're selling it to them for a good price, they really don't care what parts are inside, because it just is not their thing to know what part is original or aftermarket. In fact, most of the guys that I deal with don't even ask. They're like, it runs? Does it cut? Good. Okay. How much? Whatever. And away you go. So that's kind of been my experience with that. I know that there are other people that have different experiences, and people, start asking questions. Is this all OEM? Is this not? Whatever. But that's not really been my experience. The biggest point that Walt and Bob made, and I think it's a good one, is that if you're going to sell a saw with aftermarket parts in it, or really any parts in it, you need to be upfront about what was done. That's great, except for the fact that it's not really the buyer's responsibility to disclose everything. It's the seller's responsibility to do their due diligence. Caveat emptor is the phrase. Buyer beware. It's always buyer beware. It's always the buyer's responsibility to do their due diligence into anything that they buy. It doesn't matter whether there's a salesman that shows up at your front door, or whether somebody's selling a chainsaw or a car or whatever and what have you. There are a lot of salesmen that pull the wool over everybody's eyes, and to your average buyer, they may not know the difference. So if you want to be a buyer that knows the difference, unfortunately, you're going to have to do a lot of research. At least into chainsaws, you're going to have to do a lot of research, because there are lots of people out there that do flip saws, including myself, that do try to at least flip saws and make a buck or two. And in my experience, I don't actually make anything. So pretty much no matter what parts I use. Yes, certainly if you're putting aftermarket parts on a chainsaw, and for whatever reason it is not going to be as quality as the original, then it should be reflected in the price. And yes, that's true, but that's not the seller's responsibility. That's the buyer's responsibility to make sure that that's the case. As a buyer of chainsaws, I know what I'm doing. And also, if I buy a particular saw or a piece and it doesn't work out, it's not going to break me. For those guys in the industry, I'll just speak to those guys that are actually doing logging, those guys that are in the trees, you may just simply consider that you can't afford downtime, and you can't afford to be dealing with, frankly, guys like myself that flip saws, because you need support there, and you need your stuff to work day in and day out and day in and day out, which really, really, really means that you're going to go buy new. You have to go buy new. You can't be using this rebuilt stuff, my opinion. If you are an experienced user of saws and you know what's going on, and you want to use the modified stuff, then that's great, but the people that I've dealt with, they just need something that cuts, and they need it to cut reliably. And to be honest, for a lot of those guys that really don't want to get involved with what part is what and whether something is original or not, they just need to go buy a new saw. Use it till it busts. Flip it to somebody like myself that might want to rebuild it and play with it and tinker with it, and then move on to something new with a warranty. Today, if you buy a Husqvarna 372 on the used market, If you get a freshly rebuilt one, should be probably around the $500 range, assuming everything is in nice shape on it. You know, if it's got a new air filter, new fuel filter, line, new bearings, new seals, maybe even a new piston in it, a good piston, either OEM or a Meteor, that type of thing. If you're buying a 372 XP, the going rate is somewhere around the $500 range. If it's ported, if it's modified, then obviously the price goes up. But consider that on eBay or in some shops, you can probably pick these things up sub $800, brand new, with a warranty. So, you know, are you really saving that much if you buy something that's rebuilt? And my argument would be, for the average guy that's out there doing tree work, probably not saving that much. You're probably better off just to go buy a brand new saw. Okay, so what I wanted to get into was the fact that the Walt and Bob made, I think, a great point about knowing what you're buying and being honest about what you're selling. I get that. But what we're really talking about when you're talking about everything, what it all comes down to is actually failure modes. It's about how chainsaws fail. And when you put an aftermarket part on a saw, let's say an aftermarket cylinder head and piston, which that's an aftermarket cylinder head. This happens to be a 046 cylinder head, which is and it's big bore. If you put an aftermarket cylinder head on the saw, is that thing gonna last? You know, is it gonna last as long as an OEM cylinder head? And so let me explain my experience with this sort of stuff and try to clear some of that up. So I have rebuilt probably 50 chainsaws at this point overall. So it's not lots. It's certainly not nearly as many as Walt or Bob. But I can tell you exactly how many saws that I have had that the cylinder heads, OEM, aftermarket, whatever, I can tell you exactly how many cylinder heads are actually worn out after that period of time. And the answer is 0. For the most part, and I'm going to quote another builder, and I won't say his name, but he works with the steel 066 and the 660s and whatnot. And he actually goes through and he measures to see how much wear you get on the inside of the cylinder head. And he says they basically don't wear. This is not a wear part. Aftermarket, OEM, doesn't matter. This is not a wear part. At least the OEMs don't wear. Can the aftermarkets wear? Maybe. But the odds of you actually wearing a cylinder head out is going to be fairly minimal. So what are the failure modes? What actually happens to a chainsaw to get it to be set on the shelf? Aftermarket, OEM, whatever, doesn't matter. Why do chainsaws get set on the shelf? The biggest reason. Straight gas. The biggest reason. I love straight gas saws. Why? Because I know exactly what's wrong with it. They put the wrong gas in. Put a new cylinder head and piston in and call it a day. It's generally what you got to do. Makes a whole lot of sense. This is why most saws fail. That isn't wear, okay? That's not because the cylinder head wore out. It's not because the piston wore out. It's not because the rings wore out. It's because they used the wrong gas. Because of the wrong gas, the piston and cylinder are most likely shot, okay? But it's not straight up wear. The next thing that I see beyond straight gas is, other than improper fuel mixtures and that stuff, is air leaks. From my own building improperly, air leaks, and actually bearing failures. Straight gas air leak bearing failures kind of create air leaks. Bearing failures do a number of things. They send debris into the motor, and you end up putting all kinds of debris in there in the rings, and the rings hook and all that stuff. Cylinders get all messed up and all kinds of bad things with bearing failures. But bearing failures, if you're getting something that is wearing eccentrically, then you're going to wear out the seal, and the seal is going to the crank seals are actually going to cause an air leak. And so either the debris gets it or the air leak gets it. Those are certainly the top 3 things that happen to actually cook and kill cylinder heads, as far as I can see. These are just very, very common. Certainly you have carburetor issues. Heck, if you have a pinhole in your fuel line, the whole thing isn't going to run right. If you have a clog in the carburetor, if the pump diaphragms are stiff, there's all kinds of, let's call this fuel delivery issues. So you can have fuel delivery issues, so fuel is not going through the carburetor properly. But we talk about the top 3. So none of these really have a lot to do with aftermarket parts. You could certainly argue that you can get an air leak if you're using an inferior seal, but I haven't seen that be the case. I've not seen seals, aftermarket seals, necessarily cause air leaks. Would I say that they wear out more than OEM seals? Probably. That would, I can believe that. Bearings. That's an aftermarket bearing. This also happens to be a Japanese bearing that is of super high quality. Made in Japan. These are very quality bearings. Is this a problem to put in a chainsaw? Heck no. Heck no. These are great. In general, I'd avoid the Chinese bearings because the bearings are so important in saws. But even the Chinese bearings, the amount that people use them is going to be pretty low. And the bearing failures that I've seen are all because... Actually, So this bearing here happens to be a armored bearing. This is not sealed. It's just got a shield on it here. And the reason that I bought these instead of the open bearings is that the bearings that are open are actually more expensive, which is stupid, of course, but these I happen to get for an excellent price. And all you got to do is pop these seals out, and now you have an open bearing. Anyway, so some of the bearing failures come from overuse. Okay, probably not many. Probably most of the bearing failures come from a lubrication problem, where you're not using enough oil in your fuel. Number 1. Number 2, some of the Husqvarna failures were because they had nylon cages, and they probably got too hot. Again, maybe a lubrication issue, but the metal cages will tend to not fail nearly as much, I think, as much as the nylon ones. That's my opinion. But this is a well-lubed bearing from the factory, and you know what? That's not a problem to put in a saw. These are the things that you want to put in your chainsaws. That way they last as long as possible. So I just wanted to quickly follow up with Walt and Bob's video. 2 very, very experienced guys with saws, way more experienced with me. But I wanted to throw my 2 cents in and say that we need to define what we're talking about. We need to actually figure out what the problem is. And, there's all kinds of aftermarket parts. An exhaust gasket. You really think that's going to be a problem to have on a saw if it's aftermarket or OEM? Probably not. Have a fuel cap. Who cares? It's a fuel cap. Not a big deal. This happens to be a muffler support. Do you really think that that part has to be OEM? No. You could certainly argue that the air filter has to be OEM, but that one looks pretty nice. Okay. How about another part? How about a pull start handle? Does that really have to be OEM? No. One part that does. So this is an aftermarket part for a 372, and unfortunately, the aftermarket plastic is just not as strong as the OEM. So the center post that's in here actually breaks off more frequently on the aftermarket parts. So this is a part where you might want to go OEM and say, you know what, I need to have an original part as opposed to an aftermarket part. One other quick. So that's an OEM bar plate for a 372. That's an aftermarket bar plate. Does it really matter? Do you really believe one is going to shorten the life of the saw more than the other? No. So what's the problem with using the aftermarket? The answer is nothing. Okay, and I'm not arguing for what brand is better than the other, but some of these parts are indistinguishable. So I don't have a problem throwing OEM stuff in, and I don't have a problem throwing the aftermarket stuff in, assuming it's as good. And from the look of it, guess what? Use the aftermarket. Why not? Some other issues I've seen with aftermarket parts have to do with not the cylinder heads, although some aftermarket cylinder heads do tend to peel the plating off. But the biggest issue I've seen with aftermarket cylinders aren't with the cylinders, it's with the pistons. And with the pistons, the positioning pin sometimes falls out and ruins the whole thing. Or, another failure that I happen to have seen, is a guy actually put a piston in backwards, and it hooked a ring. So my conclusion is really simple. Buyer beware. That is not a message to the builders. That is a message to anybody that is buying anything, used or new. It is always buyer beware. Always, always, always. You have to do your due diligence, and if you're not going to do your due diligence, it's time to go down to your local chainsaw shop and pick out something that's new with a warranty. How's that for a conclusion? When we talk about parts on chainsaws, I believe we are really ultimately talking about failure modes. Will this last as long as X? And the answer is, will a aftermarket cylinder head last for 40 years? I have no idea. But in general, that type of thing is not what I see killing saws. I see saws killed from straight gas, air leaks, bearing failures, and fuel delivery issues, and that's where saws go bad, and it's not necessarily because of aftermarket parts or not. There are wear parts on chainsaws. I do not believe cylinder heads are necessarily one of them. Other things will wear out much faster. Random things happen to chainsaws anyway that actually has collateral damage, effectively, to ruin pistons and cylinders. What are wear parts? What does actually wear? The rings? Piston rings do wear. The pistons themselves do wear at least some. They can become kind of funny shaped over time. So, if you're rebuilding something, throw a new OEM or Meteor piston in it. I think guys that are quote-unquote rebuilding saws need to focus on tearing things all the way apart more often than they do. Because how many times do you want to go back in and fiddle with things? Well, if something is 20 years old in your car, odds are all the rubber's shot. So same thing on a chainsaw. If you have a 20-year-old saw, then you have to really consider that the seals are probably not good anymore. They need to be replaced. You might get lucky. Maybe it's fantastic rubber, and maybe it hasn't dry rotted and all that stuff. But odds are, it's shot. So there are things that need to be replaced. Do a carb kit. Put a new diaphragm in there. Put a new fuel line, fuel filter. Maybe even a new air filter. Those things do indeed wear, and those are all discovered when you tear a saw down. You can obviously check the rest of my YouTube channel for guides on tearing saws down. So don't be afraid of that. Don't be scared of that. If you tear it down, please tear down a chainsaw that you can actually afford to lose. First off, don't be tearing down a good one. I just saw a post. A guy ended up porting a 288 XP, and he seems to think he buggered something up. Well, he's not an experienced porter, and he happened to pick a pretty valuable cylinder head to do that on. They're not making any more of them, really. Or at least it is my understanding that that cylinder head is coming to the end of the line. So, you don't do that. So if you want to buy aftermarket stuff and fiddle with it, go crazy. I'll say one other word about buying chainsaws, and that's that you have to get it cheap. So let's take the 372 as an example, okay? So the new price on a 372 is $800 with a warranty. Roughly. You get a bar and chain, whatever. You got to go buy your oil. Might be closer to $850 or $900. On the used market, depending on where you look, you can usually find good runners for somewhere in the $500 to $600 range. Good running saws, rebuilt saws, if they're in pretty nice shape, that's about the range you're going to find them. Keep in mind, some of these saws can have hundreds of hours on them. They can have a lot of hours on them. Tree service might use them all year long and then flip them and still try to get $500 or $600 for them. Well, if you've used a saw like that, if you've used pretty much anything like that, you got to be a little more realistic in what it might be worth. But people are paying this kind of money for rebuilt, good condition 372s. Let's suppose you get a saw that has a bad top end. It's got low compression. Let's say it's actually fairly new, low compression. Well, hopefully it's straight gassed, and then you just need to put a new piston and cylinder on it. And with the new Husqvarna pricing on pistons and cylinders, you can get a cylinder kit, piston and cylinders, let's say $160, somewhere around there. So, let's say you wanted to flip a saw. Let's say you want to flip it. You got to make money. If you're going to flip it, you might as well make money. So let's do some fast math. So let's say you're going to get $500 for the saw. You're going to aim for $500 for just the power head. Not even bar and chain, nothing. $500 minus 160. All right. So if you pay $340 for that saw, you're not going to make any money. Keep in mind when you do a teardown, odds are there's going to be other stuff in there that you're going to need to replace. Even if you bought this, even if it's let's say it's a 2014 saw. 2014 saw. Great. Well, somebody's been using it for years. Odds are it needs maybe a carb kit, fuel line, filter, plug. Probably not going to need new bearings and seals. We're going to hope that. That's a hope. Hope it doesn't need new bearings and seals, and hope you don't need to actually separate the cases and all that jazz. Carb kit, fuel line, filter, plug. Okay. Price on that, maybe $35. I don't know. Maybe a new air filter. So let's say we up this to $60 worth of parts. What, including bolts? So 340 minus 60 equals 280. Okay, so you want to make, let's say you want to make $100 off this. So it's 100. So you have to get the saw for less than $180. Now, assuming it's a relatively good condition saw, otherwise the plastics look good. You don't need any other parts, beyond $60 worth of parts. Not very many people are going to sell you even a straight gassed 2014 372 for $180 or less. They're going to want more money than that. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? It's a good question. Good question. So the way, as far as I can see, the way you make money with saws is actually not by rebuilding them. It's by actually parting them out. So if you happen to pay $200 for this saw, that you have a chance that you're only going to make then $80. There's a chance, because what if you don't tighten a bolt just right? Comes back, air leak. Ruin the piston and cylinder. Now you're on the hook for that. Now we're going to make $80 and now you're out the $150 and you definitely didn't make any money. So if you are looking at trying to make money with saws, unless you almost get them for free, I'm not sure that the dollars and cents here work. I'm just not. So I wanted to throw that out there and get people to do some real math and understand that unless they're exceptionally adept at working on saws, if you're trying to flip something, the odds of you making money is going to be really low. And you can spend hours and hours and hours rebuilding stuff. Slapping a piston and cylinder on there may or may not be so easy depending on how good you are at it. So you can spend hours and hours and hours, and if you're trying to make $100 for hours and hours and hours and hours worth of work, and the risk that's there, the risk. I've had plenty of saws come back that unfortunately got an air leak because I didn't do one little thing right. One little thing, whatever it might be. So I wish that wasn't the case. I wish I, had better luck, whatever, but I don't. So if you're out there trying to flip saws or rebuild them and you're going to expect to make money, my first inclination is to say, don't expect to make any money. Unless you're really good at it, don't expect to make any money. Have fun. This is very interesting. I find the math interesting. I find the mechanics interesting. I find, figuring out how to put bearings and seals in saws very fascinating. I like buying stuff. I like seeing everything fit together. I like having all these little parts hang around. Bolts and things. By the way, that's a steel bar nut. Is that OEM or aftermarket? Who knows and who cares? Works, right? Good. Okay. So whatever you decide to do, best of luck. Be safe. Be safe. I don't think you're going to make money on saws. I just don't. That's my opinion. I'll just simply say, happy DIYing. Have fun with this hobby. I think it's fantastically interesting. I've had a lot of fun with it over the years now, and I've had a lot of heartache too, because when something comes back and you didn't do something right, I feel terrible about it. So be careful about that. Anyway, thank you so much for letting me put my 2 cents in. Thanks for Walt and Spike 60. Those guys really know what they're talking about. I just wanted to throw a couple of things more at them, and maybe they'll come back and do a response video to even what I did. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, guys, and thank you to everybody out there that's actually let me be part of this hobby and has responded well to me and to my YouTube channel and online. I really appreciate it, and I feel very much at home. So have a great day. Happy DIYing. Don't forget to subscribe.